staying with us. Well, Iran has launched fresh airstrikes against Kurdish opposition groups based in neighboring Iraqi Kurdistan late on Sunday. Comes just a week after similar attacks on the factions Tehran accuses of stroking the protest rocking the Islamic Republic. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan said that Iran had targeted it with missiles and suicide drones near the capital of Erbil. Let's bring in I-24 News correspondent Pia Sekobab joining me live in studio. Pia, good morning to you. Let's first talk about the continued protests in Iran. They're now in their 9th week, showing no sign of letting up. And I want to bring up to you Iran deploying troops to a Kurdish majority city in an attempt to regain control after it was taken over by these demonstrations while they were having a memorial service for 2 protesters who were killed. We're talking about the city of Maheb. Now, according to Iran International, the Iranian opposition site, those ceremonies turning into fierce protests, gunfire being heard, videos circulating showing really devastating images. So talk to us about these protests and how they're really showing no sign of letting up.
Right, Hamda, the situation in Iran is definitely intensifying. If we are looking at those videos from Mahaba, and if we're looking at what activists say, some people say that they're afraid, that they're scared that actually martial law will be declared. This is another level of escalation. You mentioned it, military troops being deployed to a city with a Kurdish majority to really push back the protests. This is something I believe we have not seen yet. Now, first of all, it is also remarkable how these protests are still continuing in the first place. They started more than 2 months ago as this protest that erupted after the funeral of Gina Mahsa Amini, 22-year-old Kurdish woman who died under mysterious circumstances while being in custody of the morality police after she had not worn her hijab properly. Now, these protests are really continuing all across the country. They are targeting now the very substance of the Islamic Republic, especially if we're looking at the images of the burning ancestral home of Khomeini that we've seen a couple of days ago. They're really targeting also the Islamic character of the Islamic Republic. You know, they started as these protests against the morality police, but now they're really many people are taking part in it. Not only women, but also men are standing in solidarity, and also children. And this is something I feel like we have to talk about. We've been seeing videos of young schoolgirls going to school without their headscarves, which we know from also other incidents can cost people's lives in the Islamic Republic in Iran. There's this part of protest, for example, refusing to wear hijab, but also, of course, there's this form of protest where they actually protesters clash with the security forces of the Islamic Republic, which is still desperately trying to push back these demonstrations. And the protests have seen a large number of victims. According to the numbers of the organization Human Rights Activists in Iran, at least 380 to 400 protesters have been killed. Among them have been at least 58 children. Around 16,000 people have been arrested in the crackdown of the security forces. But let's, as I said, talk about the children. Only last Wednesday, 9-year-old died when 2 gunmen riding motorcycles were targeting protesters at the central market in the city of Izeh in southwestern Iran. 7 people were killed in that incident in total. The family of that 9-year-old says that, in fact, he was killed by the Islamic Republic, whose forces were riding these motorbikes. Another worrying development are actually also the death sentences. Now, we know that Iran, anyhow, is a country with one of the largest numbers of death sentences issued. And already 2 weeks ago, a vast majority of parliament members actually signed a letter to the judiciary asking to issue death sentences to protesters who have been arrested under the pretext of them being an enemy of God. Now, we cannot actually be sure if these death penalties have actually been executed in the context of the uprising, but we know for sure that in total 5 people were sentenced to death in the wake of these protests for their involvement in these protests. And of course, this sparks fear among activists, among protesters, that Iran might now start mass executions. However, also activists are saying that these death penalties for these 5 might be an act of sham trials to deter more demonstrators.
And Pia, it's worth noting that about 2,000 others are awaiting their death penalty sentences from the Islamic Republic. But I want to move on now to these strikes. Iran launching these strikes on Kurdish opposition groups. The Kurdish National Group Kamala saying that they also targeted its installations in northern Iraq. The U.S. Central Command, who oversees these operations in the Middle East, condemning these strikes and saying that they're also illegal by the Islamic Republic. What is the latest here?
Exactly. Well, on Sunday night, Iranian forces targeted, as you said, these Kurdish opposition groups near Erbil, the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan. So we're talking about cross-border attacks here. Now, the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan said that 2 regions were attacked with missiles and suicide drones close to Erbil. Now, we don't have information about casualties yet, but this is only one of many airstrikes of Iran against the Kurdish groups in the region that we've seen recently. Now, we have to mention that Iran is basically blaming not only Western influence, but also the Kurdish influence for the incitement of the protests. We also shouldn't forget Hamda Jina Mahsa Amini. She was a Kurdish woman, and the protests broke out in the province of Kurdistan in Iran. And this national component actually plays a big role in the development of the protests. And Iran, of course, is trying to deter other Kurdish groups under the pretext of them inciting and interfering in the protests. For instance, only last week, Iran struck Kurdish organizations also in Iraq, leaving 2 dead and at least 8 wounded. Now, you see, this is not the first time, and it probably also might not be the last time the US is watching this. It might even become a topic also in the UN Security Council soon.
And Pia, these strikes coming as just one day after Turkey carried out air raids against the PKK after that deadly bombing in Istanbul that killed about 6 people and injured 80 others. Talk to us about that.
Exactly. Well, Turkey is basically blaming the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, for the blast that we've seen in Istanbul last week. The Turkish strikes in northern Syria and also in Iraq has been a direct reaction, leaving these 6 people dead, and first and foremost sparking fear that also this might turn into a wider escalation. Let's see more about this.